Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to most of you. Good morning to some of you. My name is John Brzezinski, and I'd like to welcome you to this week's webinar. Before we begin, a little bit of housekeeping. Uh, Before you ask, the answer is yes, we are recording. And of course, the second question before you ask, the answer is yes. We will be sending out a link to today's presentation after it's over. We will be taking your questions in the second half of the webinar. At the bottom of your screen, you see a little button that says Q&A. So if you have questions during the prepared portion of the webinar, please type them in. And when we get to the end, we'll respond to your questions. This is part of an ongoing webinar series by Phone to Action, which of course, just this past fall, acquired GovPredict, bringing to everyone a complete solution to help get the work of government affairs from lobbying to grassroots advocacy done. But also before we begin, let me just add a little bit of background information to today's topic. It's not that long ago that the world of grassroots advocacy was exclusively the purview of nonprofit organizations and occasionally trade associations. But the past couple of years, and especially the past 12 months, have seen a massive shift as organizations large and small across the board have embraced digital advocacy, and in particular grassroots advocacy. And the entire government affairs profession has seen tremendous changes. However, what we see from our view is that there are many lobbyists, and especially in the corporate sector, who still view advocacy as something other than what they would take care of. We hope that today's webinar will demonstrate the significant value that it can bring as part of the new reality. Speaking of the new reality, what does this mean? How do you get bills passed in the new normal? Now, not just with the coronavirus, but with the significantly shifted context that we all operate in. Well, fortunately, to help answer that question, we have a tremendous speaker for you here today. Laurent Crenshaw is head of policy for Patreon, where he leads the company's policy development, strategy, planning, and advocacy globally in the content, payments, benefits, merchandise, community, and public categories. Prior to joining Patreon, Laurent served in senior public policy roles at both Ease and Yelp. At Ease, he served as the Senior Director of Government Affairs and led the company's efforts to change banking, taxation, transportation, and possession laws at the federal and state levels to allow for businesses to deliver legal adult use cannabis. At Yelp, Laurent championed technology and fair competition issues. Additionally, he spearheaded the company's efforts to protect consumer freedom of speech online, successfully advocating for passage of legislation, again, at the federal and state levels. Now, prior to shifting to the private sector, Laurent worked in the House of Representatives for over 11 years, where, unsurprisingly, he focused on technology policy issues, particularly in the areas of intellectual property, telecommunications, and internet law. And so it's with great pleasure that I turn over the microphone to today's speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, Patreon Laurent Crenshaw.
Thanks so much, John. And thank you to Phone Action for inviting me here today to talk about this really exciting and important topic. As John has said, the landscape for grassroots and advocacy in general has changed so much just over the course of the last year, certainly over the course of the last 15 to 20 years. And it's no surprise to me in general that this change that we're seeing in both the tactics and strategies that we're finding to be successful for lobbying and grassroots advocacy are partially positioned off of technological changes that have occurred as well, just through society at large. I've been in the politics, policy space for over 20 years. I remember, or around 20 years, excuse me, I should say. I remember when I first started in this space and I would talk with lawmakers who, started in the 60s, 70s and otherwise, and they would talk about as they saw how advocacy had changed based off of technological moments, sort of like these epochs as they described it. Whether it's going back, 100 years to thinking of DC just around the time when they implemented indoor climate control, basically so that, it could be cooler in the hot DC summers and warmer in the winter times, and how that started to change the dynamic of members commingling with each other. And, in the wintertime, members from the north going to the southern states, and in the summertime, members from the south going to the northern states. Likewise, the advent of commercial air travel allowed for members to see their constituencies on a much more regular basis. So rather than staying in Washington for weeks or months on end, they then earned the ability to fly back to their district on a weekly basis to interact with their constituents more directly, hear the concerns from them, and then to take those thoughts back to Washington. And then going back into the 70s, you have C-SPAN. Once C-SPAN entered into the chamber, there was once again a dynamic that shifted, that occurred, because lawmakers, realizing that the cameras were on them at all times when they were in the chamber, started communicating through the cameras to their constituents back home, whereas not necessarily as much with each other in that forum. And likewise, constituents seeing their members on C-SPAN use that as a mechanism and a catalyst to call into those offices and to share their opinions, thus influencing that elected official and how they operated. And so the fourth change that we're really going to focus on here today and discuss in detail is how digital technology, whether it's through social platforms and just advocacy at large, how this technology through your smartphone, through your laptop, has allowed for a new degree of grassroots advocacy and organizing, but also just the mere fact that it allows for near instantaneous communications between lawmakers, members of Congress, and their constituents back home. And to dive into that a little bit more, generally speaking, lawmakers have looked at constituent outreach as basically being by the pound. It's measured by the pound. If a lawmaker got 15 or 20 phone calls on an issue, there would be a number of questions that they would go through as they're assessing the value of that constituent outreach, or I should say outreach at all. One, are they members of the district? Two, are they people who frequently call in, or those who are just generally speaking actually motivated based off of an issue and deciding to interact and to get involved? Three, are they someone who the office has helped out before, or worked with, or engaged with in a particular way? And then four, again, is scale. So all of that generally goes into play. Now, in the past, again, when a member or lawmaker was dealing with constituent services and would get, 15, 20 phone calls, maybe a few letters, those were the calculations that those were measured against. But also in that world of where there was that distance from the constituents and where there was not this perception of a need to immediately respond, that's oftentimes where your lobbyists and advocates, and whether it's through nonprofits or you're on the corporate side, they would generally fill the knowledge and the interest gap. So this is when your shoe leather lobbyists would go and walk the Hill or walk in the state capitals and say, I'm here on behalf of 200 companies or X numbers of constituents, and we care about this issue. And they were speaking as a representative of a group that in some ways may have seemed a little bit nebulous. Maybe they supported or were aligned with that lawmaker. Sometimes they may have had a different perspective, but they were the representative of the idea, the concept, and those policy points to the lawmakers in DC and in various state capitals. Now, at that point in time, organizationally speaking, that was the most effective way to basically aggregate interested, like-minded individuals who may have had connections to a member's district, and then to share that information directly with the lawmaker. Some more resourced organizations and companies as well incorporated fly-ins and other sorts of means to try to close that gap. Now, oftentimes those were seen as successful tools and opportunities, but those were also tools that were relatively limited in regards to who could use them and the costs that were attached to them. And so since then, over the last really 15 to 20 years, we've seen technology come into the mix that is now allowing for this near instantaneous communication with constituents. We see and hear it all the time now. A lawmaker goes on the Twitter either before or after a vote or just based off of an issue of the day, and they post a note or a message that really, generally speaking, is trying to communicate to their base, or that's trying to communicate to interested parties, and that's trying to engage in a conversation here. A previous president was a prolific user of social media platforms in regards to trying to convey and to deliver those messages as well. And likewise, more and more often we saw and we continue to see interested individuals turning to those platforms as a means of both receiving information and then trying to find ways that they can aggregate and organize in regards to sharing their thoughts, concerns, and opinions with lawmakers. And what we've seen is that now, if 10, 15 constituents who are from a member's district go on Twitter, say I'm from your district, or even if the analytics just indicate that they're from there and they're asking a very targeted question about a particular issue, a member's office is going to take notice now because they realize that the conversation is shifted, especially from a generational standpoint, from being more mail and telephone based to being more social, whether it's through Twitter, Facebook, or it's through a direct advocacy channel that's generated by an organization or entity like Phone to Action, or that's organized by an outside group or company as well. But it's really also about taking advantage of that technology in order to quickly collaborate around a message and deliver it to a lawmaker. And we've realized and seen that lawmakers more and more are feeling the need to respond and are looking to those channels for guidance around how they are going to position themselves on policy. And so, with that being said, as we're talking about advocacy in the digital age and from a grassroots perspective, and again, going back to this point that traditionally constituent outreach has been measured by the pound. So basically meaning volume, the more volume that you had normally elicited a result. So if you had 500 people saying we are opposed to that, that might cause consternation amongst the member or reconsideration of their approach versus, 50 people who may speak very poignantly to it, but it's only 50 versus 500. That dynamic has shifted as we now move into this digital era. And basically, as we see up here, every message that's a carbon copy of another is truly only worth about 10% of a message versus what's personalized. Meaning that as it's become easier to take a message, to replay it, to disseminate the same talking points and copy to email lists and chains and whatnot, the message can get diluted because it starts reducing the overall level of personalization. And what's fascinating is that as we've moved further into this digital age of where it seems like everything moves so quickly and you're able to scale, it's that personalization that has become key and front and center at this point, because lawmakers are trying to basically push through the noise to find the real people, the constituents, and the folks who are sharing a part of their own personal story that connects to that member in that district. And so as we see up here, now, if you can find those individual customized messages that are high quality because they are coming from constituents, you can potentially even track it down to a zip code to those that are located within the member's city or area that's near a district office or congressional office. And you can then use those profiles in order to develop higher quality touches from the constituencies to that elected official. And the outcome of that we've seen over time is a much higher impact of it, at the very least consideration and knowing that your message will break through. And that's really what at least in part what we're talking about here, is how in this era as we've shifted to digital and sort of higher numbers, that quality, that personalization, and that unique position that allows for your message to break through, to connect, and to become a pillar that spurs additional conversation, ideally that goes towards your organization's greater goals. And as we see here, phone calls, yes, are better. But when you think about a phone call, again, it's a phone call from a constituent. It's a phone call from someone who can say, I shop at the same, we'll say that at the same Safeway as the member of Congress, or I see his family going around X or Y, or like, we are a part of the community. And so I saw what happened, whether it's on C-SPAN or elsewhere. And so I'm communicating my message to you because I know my message I hope my message will have a higher impact. And so part of the goals of using this technology and these new tactics around advocacy is really shifting away from numbers or shoe leather and shifting towards personalization and people who ultimately are going to have a say as to whether or not that member gets reelected, and who have expressed and have shown a high degree of interest and passion around your particular issue. And so with that in mind, one of the very important things to talk about here is whether you're in a room with a lawmaker organizing a digital lobbying campaign, or just more broadly speaking, trying to communicate on these issues, either from a grassroots advocacy or direct lobbying standpoint, you need to have well-defined goals and objectives. This may sound a little bit obvious when I just sort of say it. It's like, okay, have a goal in mind when you're doing something, sure. But what I can tell you more directly is that while it sounds simple in concept, and execution is incredibly important here, because oftentimes campaigns may be generated around being in opposition to a particular issue, basically saying, we don't like the bill that the member is proposing or the concept that is happening here, and so we just want to defeat it. And that is a legitimate sort of rationale behind sort of rallying people together. However, at the same time, it's one that tactically speaking, whether in Washington or in various state capitals, isn't the most effective approach to actually achieve that outcome. A more effective approach, generally speaking, would be looking to both, yes, define what winning, breaking even, and losing looks like. And then within that, also identifying the metrics within your messaging that really show where and how constituents can be involved here. So you need to know, one, what your messaging is, what your winning goal is. So if you go through this campaign and this process, what the optimal outcome would be, where your compromise points are. Basically, politics is about compromise. Oftentimes in this day, age, and environment, in order to, achieve legislative outcomes, it still involves either strange bedfellows, which we'll touch on a little bit more later, but ultimately really finding ways to compromise and move forward. And so having that break-even approach, understanding what you can live with in regards to what you need to give away versus what losing would look like even, and identifying those approaches is incredibly important. And ultimately, when you're talking with members, this will all really come through as helping you to define that approach. In regards to using metrics as incentive to drive targeted action in your messaging to constituencies, this is really key. And the reason that this is key is that I found during the past, when you're spinning up a campaign around a legislative issue or a policy issue, and you're looking to activate grassroots advocacy, you need to not only have the messaging, you need to have your why, and you need to pitch it in such a way that both connects with your target audience and then presents them with courses of action. So you don't want to spin up a group around a goal or objective, but not give them outlets, not help them to understand how they should be directing that energy, whether it's in written correspondence and phone calls to elected officials, whether it's op-eds and letters to the editor, whether it is starting through their own social networks, additional groups as well within their communities to get more individuals involved. helping them to identify ways that they can both be involved and stay involved is incredibly important, because one, it takes time to really energize, expand, and to get your grassroots network up to scale. And then once it does achieve a particular degree of scale, if you don't direct those energies in towards a lawmaker, towards that objective in a relatively clear and succinct fashion, oftentimes those energies will dissipate and go elsewhere. And so really, if you're going to take the time to create the metrics, to create the objectives, and to build that messaging out for your constituencies, you need to be ready and to have the structure in place to activate it and direct it fairly quickly afterwards. And so oftentimes we do that by defining it in the course of a bill, a regulation, or an outline of some kind. Basically, the actual messaging, the topics, the copy that we are ultimately trying to rally parties around and that we're trying to share with lawmakers. I can't even tell you the number of meetings that I've gone into where you speak with lawmakers directly, you give your whole pitch, you talk about how passionate your organization is and what you care about and everything else. And then at the end, and they could say, well, it sounds like the greatest organization ever. It sounds great. And then they'll just simply say, what's your ask? Do you have an ask? What do you need? And if you don't have a clearly articulable answer that's there, that's ready, and if you aren't ready to have your grassroots organization through digital manners and others to convey that, then you're still not fully utilizing all of the energy and efforts that you've done to build up this campaign. So having a clearly definable item, even if even if your intent is to ultimately stop something bad from moving forward versus advocating proactively for legislation, you still need to have an alternative, because you have to use that language to shape the conversation. Because in a vacuum, otherwise, other parties who are either supportive of that bill or the lawmakers themselves are going to fill the oxygen in the room with their narrative. And so, again, having a clear narrative that's built into a bill, an outline, or at least draft regulatory language, conveying that messaging to your constituencies, and then galvanizing them and pointing them in the right direction so that they can release and sort of direct their passions and thoughts on it, is truly important, and are some of the elements that are necessary these days in order to achieve success from a digital grassroots advocacy campaign. So I love this last part here when we're talking about creative approaches to coalitions, because over the years, I have had the good fortune of working on a number of different coalitions that have brought a lot of folks together that you would have never imagined would be in the same room or on the same ticket. And I can mention a few, as John mentioned earlier, in particular, that stick out. So one, in my previous role at EASE, we were focused around legalization efforts, both at the state level and at the federal level for legal cannabis, and a lot of the work around building out the appropriate regulatory and legal structures there. As a part of this effort, we looked at it from many different angles. On one end, certainly you had financial service sector companies that wanted to be involved, that were interested in the idea of the market legalizing and what that would mean from banking with the money. Certainly you had a number of business entities in the states that had legalized cannabis and that were interested in seeing federal backing for that approval, or alternatively states that were looking to legalize and were trying to have a better understanding of what a model well-regulated market would look like. And then in addition to that as well, we just really, tried to there were also more traditional companies that had moved into the space as well. And so ultimately, where the opportunities presented themselves here were that we realized, as different entities and parties looked at the space, that you had this issue around elements of cannabis legalization, whether it was coming from the perspective of criminal justice reform, whether it was coming from the perspective of basically states' rights, or coming from the perspective of a medical side, that all were able to come together and to find different elements of this issue. And exactly, strange bedfellows equals success. So for example, on this issue of cannabis legalization. This is where you had, for example, the Marijuana Policy Project and the Koch Institute, or CKI, who both looked at this issue from different elements, but were able to find areas of alignment and agreement here. You had entities like the R Street Institute, along with, again, other marijuana justice organizations and others, that while they had different approaches, both saw and appreciated the alignments and understanding around this issue, and ultimately were able to find areas to be able to work in tandem at different parts of the messaging here. And so what did we see happen during this time as these groups came together? Over the last 4 years, we saw legalization in a number of states across the country, both for medical and for adult use cannabis. We saw legislation pass out of the House of Representatives for the first time ever that actually was focused on legalization as well. We continue to hear more and more members of Congress talk about this as a when, not an if scenario. And these are lawmakers on both sides of the aisle at this point. It's no longer a one-party issue, and it's seen more so from the perspective of being a systemic problem and challenge of how to address it versus whether or not it needs to be addressed. And then I'll go back a couple of years further just to give you another example of when I was at Yelp and we worked on this issue of consumer online freedom of speech. At this point, we saw a number of businesses that were attempting to stick contracts of adhesion, basically these gag clauses into consumer form contracts, basically saying that in return for getting your hair cut at my business or letting me mow your lawn, if you write a negative review, I own the copyright on that review, or I will fine you X hundreds of dollars for that review because you agreed to receive my services. Generally speaking, from a legal standpoint, we thought that those were contracts of adhesion. And we spoke with a number of lawmakers, worked with a number of other companies. We worked with, folks on the right. So for example, like Senator John Thune, Representative Leonard Lance. We worked with folks on the left, like Congressman Eric Swalwell, Senator Brian Schatz, and others. And again, we brought together organizations both on the left and on the right together on this issue. And in 2016, this was one of 2 bills related to technology that actually were passed in the Congress this year, or that year, excuse me. And I hope that the senator's office won't mind me sort of quoting this out of turn. I say this with a little bit of hesitancy, but the feedback that we got from Senator Thune's office after the hearings that we had on this legislation and bringing together this uncommon group of strange bedfellows, as we'd like to say, garnered his office said that they got more on-air interest from all. They have every morning show on the 3 major networks and 2 of the 3 evening shows. And they said that this little bill on consumer protection issues has gotten us more bipartisan goodwill than virtually anything else that we've done that year. And again, this is all based off of finding partners across the spectrum on these core issues and finding that narrative that can thread the needle between the two, in order to then go out there and using your strange bedfellows constituencies to start pulling in lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and then getting us back to that really rare C word these days, which is consensus. And then once achieving that point, actually being able to still find pathways to get things done. And so I'll sort of pause with that. And John, I'm happy to dive in to, answer more questions and to give greater clarity if there's anything I said that wasn't clear here, but I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as Laurent mentioned, we are now going to move into the Q&A section. So I will remind you, at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. That's where you type in the questions. While you're typing those in, I'll just remind everyone that especially on the grassroots advocacy side of things, Phone to Action actually offers the leading solution. As of right now, 25% of all messages sent to members of Congress go through Phone to Action. We can help you both increase the quantity of messages you send through a number of means, including text messages that drive people to action. We can also help you on the quality side. Our tools are specifically designed to guide your advocates to deliver their own personalized messages, as opposed to just clicking yes, I agree with whatever the pre-written text was. So with that being said, let's go ahead, switch over to Q&A. And I actually already see a number of questions coming in. One in particular, this is from towards the beginning of your presentation, Laurent. You mentioned that the offices take note of whether a constituent who's communicating with them is one who has frequently communicated in the past. That's conventional wisdom among a number of organizations, that those super advocates, as some people call them, are actually some of your most valuable people. But did we understand correctly that you implied that the offices take those messages less seriously, or are they in fact as valuable as most organizations tend to think they are?
Sure, John. I appreciate the question. And a big part of it is contextual. And so if, or I should say, offices over time start to learn and understand their constituencies, just as, you know, constituents who are very interested in the legislative process that call in often start to get to know the offices a little bit better as well. So as a part of that process, you know, if a office starts to understand that a constituent is passionate about the environment or animal welfare, and that is their bread and butter issue that they are, you know, that they are concerned about. And if they call in on a weekly, daily basis or something along those lines, or anytime that there's anything in the news that's there's going to be an understanding amongst the office that that is an issue that that constituent cares about. And if the congressperson does anything on that issue, they'll certainly make sure to, you know, let them be aware of that sort of messaging or position there. However, if they, you know, are hoping or expecting, the constituent is expecting to start moving the needle or getting the congressperson to do more than they have done, then that's where you start seeing diminishing returns. Once your perspective has been basically factored in, you know, especially if there start becoming political elements as to whether or not they say that I support the member or don't support the member, honestly, you're better just keeping it issue specific, because the more you can kind of keep it on the issues, the more that you're seen as an as a fair arbitrator who's just trying to hit on those points, the less that you fall into, dare I say, like the political traps, the more credibility and validity that you'll continue to maintain with the offices. Now, that being said, if you are a constituent who is a local organizer, who is someone who is actively working with individuals within your community on issues of importance, so again, we can use the environment, for example, and you're calling and basically conveying that message on behalf of that group, that is still something that typically is taken with a higher degree or grain of salt there. But even still, in this digital advocacy day and age, the office is going to say, well, if you're representing 100 people in the district and we're only hearing from you, they may ask the question of how engaged are those other 100 people if they aren't calling themselves. And it's a shift that's happened psychologically speaking amongst offices, but it's just given sort of the way in which communication occurs these days and the expectations behind it. There's more of a movement towards sort of directness amongst, you know, constituents there versus the traditional more representative model through associations, through sort of like direct people, grassroots organizations, at least around sort of like issues of the day. It's a little bit different if you're, again, working on an advocacy campaign that is targeted on a goal, and that is what you as outside entity are marshaling resources towards.
Thank you for that. We've got one that's actually incredibly detail oriented. So you mentioned that, you know, members will sometimes, before a vote, excuse me, will sometimes tweet out about the upcoming vote. Any recommendations for whether organizations, if they know that a given member does this frequently, to potentially run a campaign and, you know, wait for the tweet to come in and then press go to push their folks to reply as quickly as they can?
Yeah, you know, it's I would not wait until those moments. I think if you're waiting and being reactionary in your approach, then you and your organization are generally going to be disappointed and frustrated. Um, Again, a part of it is about shaping the narrative and controlling the narrative and utilizing as a part of your plan your constituencies to push that message. And so if you're waiting until a member is about to go onto the floor for a vote and is tweeting out something and then thinking like, okay, we're going to snap tweet this back and change their perspective, unfortunately, that's not likely to be the case, because by that point in time, it's already too late. They've already made their mind up. And then when they're doing that tweet, it's oftentimes just to make a point to, maybe get a news blurb or maybe just to kind of like give a good message and rationale for back home before they go in there. Whereas instead, honestly, I'd say if you know that a vote is coming up that's sensitive, that like you and your constituencies care about, at the very least, start a day or two before. You need that window. Oftentimes, if you can give an office 24 hours or so to synthesize inbound contacts, to identify the trends that are coming up, and then to basically assess how that messaging aligns with their own and the members' general thoughts on it, you're more likely to get a better outcome and potential for change rather than waiting to that snap moment and decision. And then also, I always encourage, as noted earlier in the creative approaches as well, to think creatively about this. Tools these days allow for, you can do geo-specific messaging. Whereas like, maybe some Snapchat ads and Twitter ads or others that are covering a particular area that are highlighting a message that you want to get out. You can, look at a number of different channels as well, whether it's through email directly, whether it is through, on Twitter and other channels, as well as different means of basically sort of like, you want to have a decent amount of widespread coverage versus just assuming that your one avenue, whether it is through a Twitter or whether it is through email or otherwise, is going to be the thing that connects. The more that you can populate it in different areas that may get eyeballs on it from different members of the congressman's office or the lawmaker's office or the lawmaker themselves, again, the more overall effective you'll be from that broader narrative and coalition goal standpoint.
That's fantastic. I think related then to what you just mentioned, you were talking about advertising. You can be as general or specific as you'd like for this one, but do you have any guidelines for effective messaging, perhaps in ads or perhaps in the subject lines of emails or any of the other ways that you're able to communicate to the advocates and the supporters who you're trying to galvanize? What are some of the rules that you have for what makes those things effective?
Absolutely. One is to be courteous, be thoughtful and in your responses, whether you are in support or in opposition. The language that you use sets the standard from the very beginning as to how that office is going to consider responding to you, whether they will approach those communications from a standpoint of wanting to negotiate and open a dialogue versus if they feel basically insulted or threatened by that language, which will create a completely different dynamic and likely close off some of those opportunities that you might otherwise have with them. Additionally, personal stories. Again, it's one thing if you are a DC or state capitol lobbyist of some kind representing a number of organizations or people, and it's another thing when you are the person who, especially if you're a constituent, who can share, the pain, the struggle, the why the law matters, why the thing matters to them. Again, we live in a world now where you can write an email, send it in, do a phone call, do a YouTube video, share it with the office. You can, a Snap, a TikTok. There are all of these different mediums to communicate. And it's really just about trying to organize and to get those unique stories and those perspectives, especially when you can hit the tags on their location, profession, otherwise, and why it matters, so that the member of Congress sees that they are a real person and that they're a person who, you know, as they're thinking through like who's more likely to be engaged and active and maybe vote for or against me as well, since oftentimes it does come back to some of those elements as well on top of the proper policy, but in order to establish that trust and credibility. Because those are the things you need to do as we're scaling. You have to have those data points in order for the office and the lawmaker themselves to know that those are trustworthy people, that they're real people, and those are people that I should care about.
This has been an absolutely fascinating session. I think we're going to go ahead and bring it to a close then. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Laurent Crenshaw, what a pleasure. Thank you for this.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, John. Thanks for having me. Thank you. Used Phone Action in the past. You all have been incredibly helpful, useful, and dynamic in regards to this whole new world of digital grassroots advocacy. And to everyone who took the time to join us today, thanks so much. You are welcome to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn or through one of the socials as well, and I'm happy to connect with you.
Wonderful. And join us again next week and every week after that, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.
Take care.